86-year-old Samuel Carter thought life had already taken everything from him. In a small Detroit neighborhood, he struggled each day to find work while his sick wife, Ruth, lay waiting at home with nothing to eat. When hunger finally pushed him to steal 2 pieces of bread, the world quickly judged him guilty. But sometimes the truth behind a mistake reveals a deeper kind of courage, the courage to suffer quietly for the one you love. This story reminds us about compassion, dignity, and the importance of treating every person with humanity. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Detroit in late winter had a way of sounding tired. Wind slipped between brick buildings and empty lots, pushing dry wrappers along the curb like restless little ghosts. The sky hung low and pale, and the streets of Maple Street looked washed out. Faded porches, peeling paint, and houses that seemed to lean on one another for balance. A weak sun hovered behind clouds, giving the neighborhood just enough light to show what time had taken. At the end of Maple Street sat a small wooden house that didn't match the new glass towers downtown, and didn't belong to the silence that had replaced the old factory hum. It was cramped, weather-worn, and stubbornly standing, like the people inside. Samuel Carter was 86, a black American man with a slim, wiry build that looked like it had been shaped by decades of labor. His deep brown skin carried fine lines, etched by sun, smoke, and long shifts. His shoulders had once been broad and powerful, but now they sloped slightly forward not from weakness of spirit but from the heavy habit of carrying life's weight without complaint. He kept his short, silver-gray hair neatly trimmed, and his eyes, dark, steady, and watchful, still held the quiet pride of a man who had spent his life keeping promises. Every morning, Samuel woke before the sun as if his body still believed in factory whistles. He moved carefully through the small bedroom, stepping around a chair with a broken leg he refused to throw away. The floorboards creaked, and he paused each time they did, listening like someone trying not to disturb a fragile piece. He pulled on his worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, then reached for a brown wool coat hanging by the door. The coat was old enough to have its own history, its sleeves shiny from years of use. Samuel checked the pockets the way some men checked their wallets, habit and hope mixed together. Mostly, there was nothing. In the living room, Ruth Carter lay on a sagging sofa near the window, wrapped in a thin blanket that used to be bright but had faded into soft grays and blues. Ruth was 82, petite and slender, with warm, deep brown skin and gentle wrinkles that made her face look kind even when she was in pain. Her hair, once thick and black, was now silver-gray, gathered into a neat low bun when she had the strength, or loosely pinned when she didn't. Her eyes were dark brown and expressive, the type that could comfort someone without a word. But lately, even those eyes looked tired. Ruth suffered from severe arthritis and a heart condition that left her breath short and her body weak. Most days, she couldn't stand for long. Some days, she couldn't stand at all. The sofa had become her world. The window, the blanket, the old lamp that flickered when it pleased, and the small table beside her where Samuel placed water, medicine, and whatever food he managed to bring home. Samuel walked toward her quietly, his boots barely lifting from the floor. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, voice low and gentle. Ruth blinked awake, her gaze finding him the way it always did, like she was counting on him to still be there. "You're up early," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Samuel gave a small smile. It was the same smile he'd used for decades, half reassurance, half determination. "Got to see what the day's got for me," he said. Ruth's lips pressed together. She didn't like hearing him talk like the day was a person who could choose to be kind. "Sam." Her voice carried the soft warning of a woman who'd spent her life loving a stubborn man. "Don't push yourself too hard." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, careful not to jostle her. "I'll be careful," he promised, because promising was easier than explaining. Their house held memories like dust. Every corner carried a story. A framed wedding photo hung crooked on the wall. Samuel in a clean suit, Ruth in a simple dress, both smiling like the world was wide open. The kitchen still had the old table where their children once did homework. Now the table was mostly bare except for a mug with a chipped handle and a pill organizer with days of the week printed in tiny letters. Their children were grown and far away. Michael Carter was their oldest. In his early 40s, Michael had Samuel's steady eyes and Ruth's gentleness, but life had carved its own edges into him. He lived in Arizona and worked as a long-haul truck driver, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-worn skin and a beard that made him look older than he was. Michael was the kind of son who tried to help, who carried guilt like extra weight in his chest, but his paychecks vanished into rent, repairs, and fuel before they could become something more. Angela Carter, their daughter, lived in Atlanta. She was in her late 30s, medium height with a slim build, warm brown skin, and expressive eyes that matched Ruth's. Her hair was usually pulled back into a practical ponytail because her job required constant movement. Angela worked as a restaurant server, always polite, always smiling even when customers were rude, because tips were unpredictable and she couldn't afford to lose them. Something in her had hardened over the years, not into cruelty, but into a tired kind of survival. She called when she could, sent small amounts when she could, and cried after hanging up more often than she admitted. They were good children in a hard world, and hard worlds don't care how good you are. A cheap phone buzzed on the small table by Ruth's sofa. Samuel glanced at it as if hoping it might bring good news. But the screen was dark. No missed calls. No messages. Samuel adjusted Ruth's blanket and then reached for the small radio near the window. He turned it on low. Static crackled, then an old soul song slipped through, soft and familiar. Ruth's eyes closed for a moment as if the music could carry her somewhere warmer. Samuel stood there a beat longer than usual. He studied Ruth's face. Her cheeks slightly hollow, her hands swollen at the joints, her breathing shallow but steady. A man could grow old and still be terrified. Samuel's fear just learned to stay quiet. "I'll be back before you know it," he said. Ruth nodded, but her eyes didn't leave him. When he turned toward the door, she spoke again. "Sam, if it's too cold." He lifted a hand, stopping her gently. "I'm all right," he said. Outside, the air bit at his face. Detroit didn't apologize for winter. Samuel pulled his coat tighter and stepped off the porch. Maple Street looked like it was holding its breath. A stray cat slipped beneath a parked car. A bus groaned in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped as if it remembered it didn't have the energy to keep going. Samuel walked slowly, his steps measured. He didn't use a cane. Pride wouldn't allow it yet, but his knees reminded him with every block that time had not been kind. He passed familiar houses with boarded windows, past a vacant lot where kids used to play, past a corner where an old man once sold newspapers. The city had changed, but Samuel still walked it like he belonged. Back at the house, Ruth stared out the window. She watched Samuel's figure shrink down the street until he blended into the gray of the day. A small movement caught her eye. Across the sidewalk, a little girl stood near a fence, hugging her arms around herself against the cold. Lily Thompson was 9 years old, small for her age with a thin build and light brown skin. Her hair was in 2 puffy ponytails, slightly uneven like someone's mother had done it in a hurry. She wore a bright pink jacket that looked too thin for winter, and her sneakers were scuffed at the toes. Lily had wide, curious eyes and a softness to her expression, the kind that made her look older than 9 when she got quiet. Lily lived 2 houses down with her mother and younger brother. Their family struggled too, but Lily had a habit of noticing other people's pain, like her heart didn't know how to mind its own business. She waved at Ruth through the glass, not loud, not demanding, just a small wave that said, "I see you." Ruth lifted a hand from beneath the blanket and waved back. Her fingers moved slowly, but her face softened. Lily walked closer, careful steps on the cracked sidewalk, then leaned toward the window. "Hi, Miss Ruth," Lily said. her voice muffled by the glass but warm. Ruth turned her head slightly so she could hear better. "Hello, baby," Ruth replied. Lily smiled. Then her gaze dropped to Ruth's blanket and the way Ruth didn't sit up. "You feeling okay today?" Lily asked, a child's version of concern. Ruth's mouth formed a small, brave smile. "Some days are better than others," she said. Lily nodded like she understood more than she should. She glanced down the street where Samuel had walked away. "Mr. Sam going to work?" she asked. Ruth hesitated. The truth was heavy, and Ruth didn't want to put it in a child's hands, but Lily wasn't really asking for details. Lily was asking because she cared. "He's trying," Ruth said softly. Lily pressed her lips together, then looked back up with bright determination. "Well, I hope he finds something," she said. Ruth watched the girl's face and felt a sting behind her eyes. Not pity, gratitude. The kind of gratitude that can break you because you don't deserve it and you need it anyway. "Thank you, Lily," Ruth whispered. Lily gave another small wave, then stepped back, bouncing a little on her feet to keep warm. "I'll come back later," she said. "Okay?" Ruth nodded. "Okay, baby." Lily turned and trotted back toward her house, the bright pink jacket flashing against the gray street like a small piece of hope. Ruth leaned her head against the couch cushion, listening to the faint music from the radio, watching the winter light crawl across the floor. In the silence, the house felt even smaller. But she wasn't alone. Not really. And somewhere out there, Samuel Carter was walking through a city that had forgotten him, carrying a love that refused to be erased. The wind rattled the window pane once, as if the world was reminding them that the day had only just begun. The cold morning light had barely warmed the sidewalks when Samuel Carter reached the end of Maple Street. The wind moved between the old buildings like a quiet reminder that winter had not finished with Detroit yet. Samuel kept his coat pulled tight around his narrow shoulders as he walked slowly toward the busier part of the neighborhood. At 86, every step carried a careful rhythm, measured, patient, stubborn. He moved like a man who had walked these streets his whole life and refused to let age or hardship erase that claim. Samuel Carter had once been strong enough to lift steel beams with bare hands. Decades earlier, he had worked at the Riverfront Steel Plant, a massive industrial complex that once roared day and night along the Detroit River. Back then, Samuel had been tall and broad-shouldered, a young black man with powerful arms, steady eyes, and the kind of quiet determination that factory foremen respected, even if they never said it aloud. But the plant had closed years ago when the industry shifted and machines replaced men. Many workers had left the city. Samuel stayed, partly because he had nowhere else to go, and partly because Maple Street held every memory that mattered. Now his body was thinner, his back slightly bent, and the strength in his hands had softened into a trembling patience. But the habit of work still lived inside him like an old engine that refused to shut down. He walked first toward a small car wash on Jefferson Avenue. The place was already busy with early commuters. Water sprayed in long silver arcs, and the sound of rotating brushes filled the cold air. A young man named Tyler Jenkins stood near the entrance collecting payment from drivers. Tyler was about 22, tall and lanky with pale skin, messy blonde hair, and a thin mustache that seemed uncertain whether it wanted to grow. He wore a bright yellow jacket with the company logo stitched on the chest. Tyler was friendly enough, but carried the distracted confidence of someone who had never truly worried about missing a meal. Samuel approached slowly, removing his hat. "Morning," he said politely. Tyler glanced up. His eyes paused briefly on Samuel's gray hair and worn coat. "Morning," Tyler replied. Samuel nodded toward the equipment area where workers moved quickly between vehicles. "You folks need any extra help today? I can sweep dry cars, carry buckets, anything." Tyler shifted his weight awkwardly. He wasn't cruel, he simply didn't know what to do with the request. I don't think so, sir," he said, Manager only schedules the regular guys. Samuel nodded once, accepting the answer without argument. Well, thank you anyway. He stepped back onto the sidewalk. Tyler watched him walk away and felt a small, uncomfortable tug in his chest, though he quickly buried it beneath the rhythm of the job. Samuel continued down Jefferson Avenue, his breath visible in the cold air. The streets slowly filled with traffic, people heading to offices and warehouses, coffee cups steaming in their hands. He passed a grocery store with bright posters advertising fresh produce and discount bread. The store manager, a woman named Carla Mendoza, stood near the entrance checking inventory on a clipboard. Carla was in her early 40s, medium height with olive-toned skin and dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face carried the serious expression of someone who had spent years balancing business pressure and family responsibilities. She had immigrated to the United States from Mexico as a teenager and had built her career through long hours and strict discipline. Carla believed deeply in fairness, but she also believed rules kept things running. Samuel approached with the same respectful tone. "Ma'am," he said, "are you hiring?" Carla looked up from the clipboard. Her sharp brown eyes examined him carefully. "We're not right now," she said. Samuel nodded. "I could help stock shelves or sweep the back. I've done warehouse work before." Carla hesitated for a second. Something in Samuel's calm voice and humble posture stirred sympathy. But the store already struggled to stay profitable, and corporate policies were strict. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Company rules." Samuel tipped his hat politely. "I understand." He walked away again, leaving Carla watching him longer than she expected. The day moved slowly as Samuel continued his search. He stopped by a gas station where trucks rumbled through the pumps. The owner, a heavyset man named Leonard Patel, stood inside the glass booth counting receipts. Leonard was in his 50s, short and round with graying hair and thoughtful dark eyes behind rectangular glasses. Years earlier, his family had immigrated from India, and he had built the small business through relentless work. But the station barely stayed open due to competition from large chains. Samuel asked the same question. "Sir, do you need help cleaning or carrying deliveries?" Leonard looked at him through the window and sighed. "I wish I could hire everyone who asks," he said kindly, "but I can barely afford my own workers." Samuel gave a grateful nod and moved on. By midday, the sky had grown heavier with gray clouds. Samuel reached a construction site several blocks away where a half-built apartment complex rose above the street. Loud machinery clanged while workers in bright helmets carried boards and tools. The foreman stood near the gate shouting instructions. His name was Greg Watson, a broad man in his mid-40s with rough hands and a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against metal. Greg had spent his entire adult life in construction and believed work required speed, youth, and endurance. Samuel approached the gate. "Excuse me," he said. Greg glanced at him briefly. "What is it?" "I'm looking for work," Samuel replied. "Anything you need done." Greg looked him up and down. His thin arms, slow posture, gray hair. "You see those ladders?" Greg said, pointing toward the scaffolding. "You'd be halfway up before lunch and halfway to the hospital before dinner." The nearby workers chuckled softly. Samuel didn't respond, he simply nodded. "Thank you for your time." Greg watched him walk away and muttered under his breath, not unkindly but bluntly, "World's too hard for old men." Samuel didn't hear the words clearly, but he felt their meaning. By late afternoon, his legs were tired and his stomach had begun to ache with hunger. He stopped near a public bench to rest for a moment. Across the street, a police cruiser rolled slowly along the block. Inside sat Officer Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks was 38, tall and athletic with a calm, disciplined presence. His deep brown skin and closely cropped black hair gave him a clean, professional appearance, and his dark eyes carried the steady alertness of someone trained to observe everything. Daniel had grown up not far from this neighborhood and understood its quiet struggles better than many officers. His father had been a factory mechanic who lost his job when the same steel plant closed years ago. That memory had shaped Daniel's personality, firm but thoughtful, cautious but compassionate. He noticed Samuel walking along the sidewalk. The old man's posture caught his attention. Not suspicious, just tired. Daniel slowed the cruiser slightly, watching Samuel move past a row of trash bins behind a convenience store. Samuel paused, glancing around to make sure no one was watching too closely. Then he began quietly sorting through the bins. Inside were aluminum soda cans mixed with paper and food wrappers. Samuel carefully pulled out several empty cans and placed them into a plastic bag he carried inside his coat. He worked slowly and methodically. Daniel observed from the car but did not approach. There was no crime in collecting recyclables. In fact, he had seen many elderly residents do the same. Still, something about Samuel's careful movements stayed in his mind. Samuel eventually straightened up, holding a small bag of cans that rattled softly together. He walked toward a recycling machine near a corner grocery store and fed them into the slot one by one. The machine blinked and printed a thin receipt, $2.30. Samuel folded the paper carefully like it was something valuable. Daniel watched him for another moment before driving on. Back on Maple Street, the afternoon light faded slowly behind the rooftops. Inside the small wooden house, Ruth Carter remained on the sofa near the window. Her breathing had grown heavier during the day, though she tried to hide it whenever Samuel was around. Her joints ached with a dull burning pain that spread through her shoulders and knees. Sometimes even lifting a glass of water felt like moving a stone, but she had learned not to complain. Ruth had always been the strong one emotionally, the quiet heart of the family. When Samuel worked long shifts in the factory years ago, she raised the children, cooked meals, and held the house together through layoffs and economic downturns. Hardship had shaped her patience, not her bitterness. She glanced toward the door and whispered to herself, "Don't worry him." Outside, Lily Thompson passed by again on her way home from school. She slowed near the window, noticing Ruth resting with her eyes closed. Lily quietly placed a small folded drawing on the windowsill, a picture she had made at school showing a house, 2 smiling stick figures, and a bright yellow sun. Then she walked away before Ruth woke. As evening settled over Maple Street, Samuel Carter slowly turned the corner and headed home with the small receipt in his pocket. It was not much, but it was all he had earned that day. He climbed the porch steps carefully, preparing the same gentle smile he always wore when he walked through the door. The next morning on Maple Street arrived quietly, wrapped in a gray sky that looked heavier than the day before. The wind had calmed, but the cold still pressed against the windows of the small wooden houses lining the street. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass along the sidewalk, and the early traffic in Detroit sounded distant, like a city breathing somewhere far away. Inside the Carter house, the kitchen felt colder than the air outside. Samuel Carter stood in front of the small refrigerator with the door open, his hand resting against the frame as if the machine itself could offer answers. The dim yellow light inside revealed almost nothing. An empty shelf. A half-empty bottle of tap water. Nothing else. Samuel slowly closed the door, then opened the narrow pantry cabinet beside the stove. The wooden door creaked softly. Inside sat 3 lonely items. A small salt shaker with only a thin line of salt at the bottom, half a packet of old tea folded neatly with a paper clip, and the same bottle of water he had already seen. For a long moment, Samuel simply stared. His stomach twisted with hunger, but the heavier feeling came from knowing Ruth would wake soon. Samuel Carter had never been a man who feared hard work. For most of his life, effort had been enough. If something was broken, he fixed it. If money ran low, he worked another shift. But hunger was different. Hunger did not respond to patience or determination. He poured a small glass of water and placed it on the table before Ruth woke up. In the living room, Ruth Carter stirred slowly beneath the thin blanket. Morning light filtered through the old curtains and rested across her face. She blinked and looked toward the kitchen where Samuel moved quietly. "Morning, Sam," she said gently. Samuel turned with a soft smile already prepared. "Morning, sweetheart." Ruth watched him carefully. Even after 60 years together, she could still read the smallest change in his expression. His smile looked slightly tighter than usual. "You eat already?" she asked. Samuel nodded immediately. "Had a sandwich while I was out early," he said. The lie came smoothly. Samuel hated lying to Ruth, but he hated the thought of her worrying more. Ruth studied him for a moment. Her dark eyes were wise enough to question the story, but she chose not to push further. "That's good," she said quietly. Samuel poured warm water into a cup and dropped the half-tea packet inside, letting the faint color spread through the liquid. Ruth lifted the cup slowly. Her hands trembled from arthritis, but she hid the pain behind a calm expression. "I'm not very hungry today anyway," she said. That was her lie. Samuel knew it, but he nodded as if he believed it. The silence between them carried the weight of two people protecting each other from the same truth. Outside, the street gradually came to life. A delivery truck rumbled past, and somewhere a neighbor started a lawnmower that coughed loudly before settling into a steady buzz. Samuel sat at the kitchen table pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. In reality, his mind kept drifting toward the empty pantry. An hour later, he stood again. "I'm going out for a bit," he said. Ruth nodded. "Don't stay too long in the cold." Samuel left the house slowly, stepping carefully down the wooden porch stairs. Maple Street looked the same as always, quiet, worn, patient. But Samuel's body felt weaker than it had the day before. Hunger drained strength faster than age. He walked toward a nearby recycling station where he sometimes exchanged aluminum cans for small change. Along the way, he passed a narrow alley behind a convenience store. A stray dog stood near the trash bins. The dog was medium-sized, perhaps 5 years old, with thin brown fur and white patches along its chest. One ear bent slightly forward while the other stood straight up, giving the animal a permanently curious expression. Its ribs were visible beneath its coat, and its cautious dark eyes watched Samuel carefully. Samuel slowed his steps. "Well now," he murmured softly. The dog did not bark. It simply observed him with the wary patience of an animal that had learned the world was unpredictable. Samuel crouched slightly despite the stiffness in his knees. "You look hungry too, friend." The dog tilted its head but kept its distance. Samuel sighed gently. "Wish I had something for you." After a moment, the dog trotted away down the alley, disappearing behind a fence. Samuel straightened slowly and continued toward the recycling machine. The bag of cans he had collected earlier produced only a few more coins today. The machine printed a thin receipt worth less than $3. Samuel folded the slip carefully and placed it into his pocket. He did not buy food. Instead, he walked home. Back on Maple Street, Ruth spent most of the afternoon resting near the window. Her breathing grew heavier at times, but she refused to call Samuel. She did not want him rushing home worried. The hours passed slowly. Late in the afternoon, a small figure appeared again on the sidewalk outside. Lily Thompson approached the Carter house with careful steps. Lily was still wearing the same bright pink jacket from earlier in the week, though today the sleeves looked slightly dirtier from playground games. Her backpack hung loosely from one shoulder, and her ponytails bounced gently as she walked. Lily paused near the window and peered inside. "Hi, Miss Ruth," she said with a cheerful voice. Ruth smiled weakly. "Hello, Lily." Lily studied Ruth for a moment. Children often notice things adults hide. "You look tired today," Lily said honestly. Ruth chuckled softly. "Just resting." Lily nodded, then reached into the pocket of her jacket. She pulled out a small red apple. "My mom said I could bring you this," Lily said. Ruth hesitated. That's very sweet of her. But Lily's eyes flickered briefly toward the ground. The truth was simpler. The apple had come from Lily's school lunch earlier that day. She had quietly slipped it into her pocket instead of eating it. Samuel returned at that moment, stepping onto the porch. Lily turned toward him with a bright smile. "Hi, Mr. Sam." Samuel's tired face softened instantly. "Well, hello there, Miss Lily." Lily held up the apple proudly. "I brought this for you and Miss Ruth." Samuel looked at the fruit for a moment longer than necessary. The red skin shone in the afternoon light like something precious. "You sure about that?" he asked gently. Lily nodded enthusiastically. Samuel accepted it carefully as if the apple might break. "Thank you, sweetheart." Inside the house, Samuel placed the apple on the small kitchen table. Ruth watched him from the sofa. "That's a beautiful apple," she said softly. Samuel picked up a small kitchen knife and sliced the fruit slowly. The apple broke cleanly into two halves. For a moment, Samuel stared at the pieces. Even divided, they looked small. He placed one half on a plate for Ruth. "You eat this," he said. Ruth shook her head. "No, Sam, you take it." Samuel smiled gently. "We'll share." He cut the halves again, creating 4 thin slices. Each of them took 2 slices. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. The sweetness filled their mouths and lingered longer than the fruit itself. When the last piece disappeared, Samuel placed the knife down quietly. Ruth leaned back against the sofa cushion, closing her eyes for a moment. "That was nice," she whispered. Samuel nodded. Yes, it was. Outside, evening shadows stretched across Maple Street as the sun dropped behind the buildings of Detroit. Inside the small wooden house, the Carter kitchen returned to silence, and the cupboard was still empty. Night came early over Detroit that evening, and Maple Street slipped into darkness long before most people were ready to sleep. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pale yellow circles onto the cracked pavement. The air had grown colder than the day before, and a thin wind moved quietly between houses, rustling dry leaves along the sidewalks. The city was not silent. Distant engines hummed and occasional sirens echoed somewhere far away. But here on Maple Street the night felt still, almost watchful. Inside the small wooden Carter house, Samuel Carter sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him. The room was dim, except for a small lamp on the counter that cast a warm but weak light across the empty table. His body felt lighter than it should have, as if hunger had begun to hollow him from the inside. Across the room, Ruth Carter rested on the sofa under the thin blanket. Her breathing was quiet, but Samuel could see the way her chest rose slowly with effort. She had fallen asleep sometime after sunset, her head turned slightly toward the window where the streetlight glowed through the curtains. Samuel watched her for a long moment. Ruth looked smaller when she slept. The years had softened her once strong posture into a fragile stillness, yet Samuel still saw the woman she had been for decades, the one who had raised their children, cooked warm dinners after long factory shifts, and held his hand through every hardship life had thrown at them. Samuel stood carefully, trying not to wake her. His stomach twisted again with the sharp ache of hunger. The apple slices from earlier had faded from memory as quickly as they had disappeared. He moved toward the door and quietly slipped on his coat. Just a walk, he told himself. Outside, the cold air wrapped around him instantly. Samuel stepped down from the porch and began walking slowly down Maple Street. His boots made soft scraping sounds on the pavement as he moved toward the brighter lights of Jefferson Avenue. Detroit at night carried a different rhythm. The daytime traffic had faded, replaced by quieter movements, late buses passing through intersections, delivery trucks loading behind stores, and occasional pedestrians moving quickly through the cold. Samuel walked without a clear destination. Hunger guided him more than thought. Several blocks away, the warm glow of storefront lights appeared along Jefferson Street. A few small businesses were closing for the night, their employees sweeping floors or locking doors. Samuel turned the corner and slowed. That was when he smelled it. Bread. Fresh bread. The warm scent drifted through the cold air like something alive, something inviting. Butter, yeast, and heat blended together into a smell so comforting it almost felt painful. Samuel stopped walking. Across the street stood a small bakery with a glowing sign above the window. Miller's Bakery. The shop was narrow but cozy, with large glass windows that revealed shelves of bread and pastries inside. The light from the ovens painted the interior in golden tones that looked almost unreal compared to the cold darkness outside. Samuel stepped closer to the window. Inside, trays of fresh bread rested on metal racks. Round loaves, long baguettes, soft rolls dusted lightly with flour. Steam still rose faintly from some of them. Samuel swallowed hard. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet street. Behind the counter stood the bakery owner, Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller was a 50-year-old man with broad shoulders and thick arms shaped by years of kneading dough and lifting heavy flour sacks. His sandy brown hair had begun turning gray at the temples, and his beard was trimmed short but uneven. Miller had the tired eyes of someone who woke before dawn every day to run a small business. His personality leaned toward impatience, not because he was cruel, but because years of financial pressure had made him constantly alert for problems. Running a bakery in a struggling neighborhood meant every loaf mattered. Inside the shop, Miller was stacking trays while preparing to close for the night. Samuel stood outside the glass window longer than he intended. He told himself to walk away, but the smell of bread wrapped around him again. Warm, fresh, real. His mind drifted briefly to the image of Ruth lying on the sofa back home. 2 days without food. Samuel placed a trembling hand against the cold glass of the bakery window. The warmth inside seemed like another world. Inside, Miller turned toward the back of the store. The kitchen door swung open as he stepped inside to check the ovens. For a moment, the front counter stood empty. Samuel's heart began beating faster. His thoughts tangled together. Just one. Just enough for Ruth. Samuel stepped toward the door. The small bell above it chimed softly as he pushed it open. The warmth of the bakery surrounded him immediately. It smelled even stronger inside. Fresh bread, melted butter, and sugar from pastries cooling on the racks. Samuel moved quickly toward the front tray. His hands trembled as he reached for 2 small bread rolls resting near the edge. They were still warm. Samuel held them tightly, almost afraid they might disappear. He turned toward the door. That was when a voice came from behind him. "Hey!" Samuel froze. Thomas Miller stood at the kitchen doorway staring directly at him. Miller's expression shifted from confusion to anger within seconds. "What do you think you're doing?" Miller demanded. Samuel's heart pounded violently. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. I wasn't," he stammered. Miller stepped closer, his boots striking the floor with heavy steps. "Put those down." Samuel's fingers tightened nervously. He backed toward the door. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His hands shook so badly that the bread rolls slipped. Both loaves fell to the floor with a soft thud. For a moment, no one moved. Miller's face hardened. "You stealing from me?" he snapped. Samuel lowered his head, shame flooding through him. "I'm sorry," he repeated quietly. Miller grabbed Samuel's arm before he could move. "You think I run a charity here?" Miller said sharply. Samuel didn't struggle. His body felt too tired, too empty. "I was just—" Samuel began. But he stopped himself. He would not speak about Ruth. Not like this. Miller pulled out his phone with one hand while still gripping Samuel's coat sleeve. "You're staying right here," he said. Samuel remained silent as Miller dialed. The call lasted less than a minute. "Yeah," Miller said into the phone. "I've got someone here stealing bread, Jefferson Street, Miller's Bakery." Samuel stared quietly at the floor where the bread rolls still lay. Several minutes passed. Outside, the flashing lights of a patrol car appeared through the window. The door opened, and Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside. Daniel Brooks looked the same as earlier that day, tall, composed, wearing a dark police uniform with the Detroit police badge on his chest. His posture was straight, but his eyes always scanned the room carefully before speaking. "What's going on?" Daniel asked calmly. Miller pointed at Samuel. "Caught him taking bread." Daniel glanced at Samuel. Recognition flickered across his face. It was the same elderly man he had seen collecting cans earlier. Daniel turned to Samuel. "Sir?" he said gently. "Is that true?" Samuel lifted his head slowly. His voice was quiet but steady. "Yes." Miller crossed his arms. "See? Told you." Daniel sighed softly. Procedure required action. He stepped forward and carefully took Samuel's wrists. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with a cold sound that echoed through the bakery. Samuel did not resist. He simply stood there with his head lowered. The warm smell of bread still filled the room. 1 week later, the winter sky above Detroit remained dull and pale, the kind of sky that looked tired of carrying the cold. Snow from earlier in the week had melted into gray slush along the streets, and the wind pushed the damp air through the tall buildings downtown. Cars moved steadily through traffic near the Wayne County Courthouse, a large stone building that stood with heavy columns and wide steps like an old monument to law and order. Inside that courthouse, the air smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and quiet tension. Samuel Carter stood near the front of a modest courtroom, his thin hands trembling slightly at his sides. The orange detention jacket he wore hung loosely over his frail shoulders. His posture was still upright, but the long week had drained much of the strength from his body. His face looked more lined than usual, and the hunger he had carried days earlier had not completely left him. At 86 years old, Samuel had never imagined standing in court like this. He had worked factories, paid taxes, raised children, and lived quietly for decades. Yet here he was, an old man accused of stealing bread. The courtroom itself was small compared to the grand halls often seen in movies. Wooden benches lined the back rows, and a few people sat scattered among them, some waiting for their own hearings, others simply curious observers. A soft hum from the heating vents echoed faintly through the room. Near the side wall stood Officer Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks looked calm and professional in his dark blue police uniform. His posture was straight, and his expression carried the same thoughtful seriousness Samuel had noticed the night of the arrest. At 38, Daniel had already spent over a decade serving the Detroit Police Department. His tall, athletic build and composed demeanor made him look confident, but his eyes often revealed a deeper sense of reflection. During the past week, Daniel had thought about Samuel Carter more than he expected. The image of the old man standing silently in the bakery had stayed in his mind. Something about Samuel's quiet acceptance had not felt like the behavior of a typical thief. Daniel folded his hands behind his back as he waited. At the front of the courtroom sat the presiding judge. Judge Harold Whitman was 63 years old, a tall white man with a firm posture and a sharp face marked by age lines earned through decades in the legal profession. His silver-gray hair was combed neatly to the side, and his blue-gray eyes carried the steady authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Whitman had served on the Wayne County bench for nearly 15 years. He was known as a strict but fair judge who believed deeply in personal responsibility and the rule of law. His upbringing had shaped those beliefs. As the son of a police officer in Chicago, Whitman had grown up hearing stories about crime, discipline, and consequences. Those lessons had hardened his view of wrongdoing over time. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the file in front of him. The courtroom clerk stood nearby. Her name was Margaret Ellis, a quiet woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and soft eyes behind reading glasses. Margaret had worked in the courthouse for over 20 years and carried herself with calm professionalism. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but she had witnessed enough human stories within these walls to recognize when something deeper lay beneath a simple case. "Case number 417, Margaret announced gently. "Samuel Carter." Samuel stepped forward slowly. The courtroom fell quiet. Judge Whitman looked up from the file and studied the elderly man standing before him. For a moment, he simply observed Samuel's posture, his worn hands, the faint tremor in his shoulders. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his voice firm but measured. "You are accused of theft from a local bakery. Is that correct?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Whitman leaned forward slightly. "Did you take the bread from Miller's Bakery on Jefferson Street?" Samuel lowered his head. "Yes, sir." His voice was calm and clear. A quiet murmur passed through the courtroom benches before fading again. Judge Whitman continued reading from the file. "The report states you attempted to leave the store with 2 bread rolls without payment." Samuel remained silent. Whitman closed the folder and looked directly at him. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air. Samuel hesitated. For a moment he considered telling the full truth. He imagined explaining about Ruth, about the empty kitchen, the apple slices, the 2 days without food. But the thought of strangers visiting his home, questioning Ruth, disturbing her fragile health, he could not allow that. Samuel lifted his head slightly. "I was hungry," he said. Judge Whitman's eyebrows tightened. "That is your explanation?" Samuel nodded once. Whitman's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Carter, this city struggles enough without people stealing from small businesses trying to survive." Samuel listened quietly. Whitman continued, his voice sharper now. "Why is it that so many people think the rules do not apply to them?" Samuel remained still. The judge's tone carried the frustration of years spent watching similar cases pass through the courtroom. "Do you understand what theft means?" Whitman asked. "Yes, sir." "And yet you did it anyway." Samuel spoke softly. "I had not eaten for 2 days, sir." The room fell silent. Even the heating vents seemed to pause. Judge Whitman blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the quiet honesty of the statement. In the back row, Margaret Ellis lowered her eyes toward the floor. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his weight slightly, his expression tightening. Whitman leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel again. The old man's face showed no anger, no excuses, only exhaustion. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Whitman turned toward the bailiff standing near the door. The bailiff was a broad man named Robert Gaines, a former Marine in his late 40s with close-cropped hair and a disciplined posture. Robert had spent years maintaining order inside the courtroom and rarely showed emotion during cases. "Mr. Gaines," Whitman said quietly, "would you step to the cafeteria and bring back a hamburger?" The request surprised several people in the room. Robert nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." He left the courtroom. Minutes passed in silence. Samuel stood quietly in place, unsure what the judge intended. When Robert returned, he carried a small wrapped hamburger from the courthouse cafeteria. The warm smell of grilled meat spread faintly through the room. Robert handed the food to the judge. Whitman held it out toward Samuel. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Here." Samuel hesitated, confused. Whitman gestured again. "Take it." Samuel stepped forward slowly and accepted the hamburger with both hands. The warmth of the paper wrapper felt strange after days of cold. Without hesitation, Samuel unwrapped the sandwich. The smell alone made his stomach tighten. But instead of eating, Samuel carefully broke the hamburger into 2 pieces. He held one half in his hand. Judge Whitman watched him closely. "Why didn't you eat it?" the judge asked. Samuel looked down at the bread in his hands. "My wife is at home," he said quietly. He paused. "She hasn't eaten in 2 days either." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Silence spread across the courtroom. Margaret Ellis removed her glasses slowly. Officer Daniel Brooks looked toward the floor. Even Robert Gaines stood unusually still beside the door. Judge Whitman did not speak for several long seconds. The old man still held half the hamburger, as if protecting something fragile. For several long seconds after Samuel Carter spoke, the courtroom remained completely silent. The quiet was not the ordinary silence of a legal proceeding. It was heavier, deeper, the kind of silence that settles when everyone in the room suddenly realizes something important at the same time. Samuel still stood at the center of the courtroom floor, the thin paper wrapper of the hamburger crinkled gently in his trembling hands. One half remained untouched in his palm. The other rested against the wrapper as if waiting. Judge Harold Whitman leaned back slowly in his chair. The stern expression that had marked his face earlier softened slightly as he studied the elderly man in front of him. Whitman had presided over thousands of cases during his years on the bench: robberies, fraud, violence, arguments over property and money. Most defendants came into the courtroom with excuses or anger. Samuel Carter had come with neither. Whitman removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk in front of him. "You're telling this court," Whitman said quietly, "that you intended to bring that food home." Samuel nodded once. "Yes, sir." His voice carried no bitterness, only tired honesty. "My wife hasn't eaten either." In the back row, someone sniffled quietly. Margaret Ellis, the courtroom clerk, lowered her head slightly as she wiped the corner of her eye with a folded tissue. Margaret had spent over 2 decades recording court proceedings with steady professionalism. She had seen criminals and victims, arguments and confessions, but something about the dignity in Samuel's voice unsettled her deeply. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the wall with his arms folded loosely behind his back. His jaw tightened slightly as he looked toward the floor. In his career as a police officer, Daniel had arrested hundreds of people. Procedure required quick decisions. The night at the bakery, he had simply followed the law. But hearing Samuel speak now, Daniel felt an uncomfortable weight pressing against his chest. He remembered the old man standing quietly while the cuffs closed around his wrists. He remembered the way Samuel had not argued. Daniel realized he had never asked why. At the front of the room, Judge Whitman cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Carter," he said. Samuel lifted his eyes again. "Yes, Your Honor." Whitman studied the thin figure standing before him. Samuel's coat hung loosely around his shoulders. His hands still trembled slightly from age and exhaustion. The judge looked down briefly at the case file before closing it. "The court recognizes that theft is a crime," Whitman began slowly, "but the law must also recognize circumstances." He paused. The courtroom seemed to lean forward in anticipation. "In this case," Whitman continued, "it is clear that the defendant did not act out of greed or malice." Samuel remained silent. Whitman turned slightly toward the bailiff. "Mr. Gaines." Robert Gaines, the large former Marine serving as courtroom bailiff, straightened immediately. His broad shoulders and disciplined stance reflected years of military training. Though Robert rarely showed emotion during court proceedings, his eyes now rested thoughtfully on Samuel. "Yes, Your Honor. Remove the restraints from Mr. Carter." Robert stepped forward without hesitation. Though Samuel had not been cuffed during the hearing, a small security clasp still secured his wrists loosely. The metal latch clicked open. Samuel's hands were free. The sound seemed to echo through the room. Judge Whitman continued, "The charges against Samuel Carter are dismissed." A soft wave of murmurs moved through the courtroom benches. Margaret Ellis quietly covered her mouth. Officer Daniel Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Samuel stood still for a moment, as if he had not fully understood the words. "You may go home, Mr. Carter," Whitman said gently. Samuel nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir." He carefully wrapped the remaining half of the hamburger back in the paper. The simple action caught the attention of several people in the room. Samuel did not eat it. He placed the food inside his coat pocket. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon air carried the crisp bite of Detroit winter. The sky remained gray but brighter than earlier in the week. Samuel walked slowly down the courthouse steps with careful, deliberate movements. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped outside a moment later. "Mr. Carter," he called softly. Samuel turned. Daniel approached with a calm, respectful expression. Up close, Samuel looked even older than he had inside the courtroom. His eyes were tired, but still steady. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, "I'm sorry." Samuel blinked slightly. "For what?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "For not asking more questions that night." Samuel gave a small, understanding smile. "You were doing your job." Daniel nodded, but did not look fully convinced. Samuel tipped his head politely and continued down the sidewalk. The bus ride back toward Maple Street felt long but peaceful. Samuel sat quietly near the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of gray buildings and winter trees. In his pocket, the half-hamburger remained warm enough to remind him of its purpose. Back at the small wooden house, Ruth Carter lay resting on the sofa as usual. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the living room. When the door opened, Ruth slowly turned her head. "Sam?" she called weakly. Samuel stepped inside, removing his hat. "I'm home." Ruth noticed the tired relief in his voice. "What happened?" she asked carefully. Samuel walked toward the small table beside the sofa and gently unwrapped the paper. Inside rested the half-hamburger. Ruth's eyes widened slightly. "Where did you—" Samuel sat beside her. "Long story," he said softly. Ruth looked at the food as if it were something precious. Samuel broke the remaining half again into 2 smaller pieces. "You first," he said. Ruth took a small bite. Her eyes filled slowly with tears as she chewed. Not because the food was special, but because it meant Samuel had come home. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Harold Whitman returned to his quiet house in a suburban neighborhood north of Detroit. Whitman lived alone in a modest but well-kept brick home, surrounded by bare winter trees. His wife had passed away several years earlier, leaving the house unusually quiet. Though the judge maintained a disciplined lifestyle, reading legal journals, walking each evening, keeping his schedule organized, some nights the silence felt heavier than he preferred. That evening was one of those nights. Whitman sat in his study chair, staring at the closed file he had brought home from the courthouse. Samuel Carter. The name lingered in his thoughts. The judge leaned back and rubbed his temple. After several minutes, he stood, walked toward the desk phone, and dialed a number. The voice that answered belonged to Karen Lewis. Karen Lewis worked as a coordinator for Detroit's Department of Social Services. She was a woman in her early 40s with short, curly black hair and warm brown eyes. Karen had spent most of her career assisting elderly residents who struggled with housing, medical care, or food insecurity. Her calm, compassionate nature made her particularly effective in difficult situations. "Department of Social Services," she said. "Ms. Lewis," Whitman said calmly. "This is Judge Harold Whitman." Karen sat up slightly straighter. "Yes, Your Honor." "I have a case I believe requires your attention." Whitman briefly explained the situation. Karen listened carefully. "I'll look into it," she said. "Thank you," Whitman replied quietly. Across the city that same evening, Officer Daniel Brooks drove slowly through Maple Street during his regular patrol. He had not planned to stop, but when he passed the Carter house, he slowed the car. A faint light glowed in the front window. Daniel parked along the curb for a moment, studying the small wooden house thoughtfully. He made a mental note. Tomorrow, he would come back. Morning came slowly over Maple Street the next day. The sky above Detroit carried a pale blue color for the first time in several days, and the cold wind had softened into a quiet winter breeze. Sunlight filtered gently between the narrow houses along the street, touching the cracked sidewalks and faded porches with a warm, golden glow that felt almost unfamiliar after so many gray days. Inside the small Carter house, Samuel Carter woke early as he always did. Years of factory work had trained his body to greet the morning before the sun had fully risen. Even at 86, that habit had never left him. He sat carefully on the edge of the old wooden chair beside the kitchen table, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The small house felt unusually peaceful that morning. Ruth Carter still slept on the sofa near the window, her breathing soft and steady beneath the thin blanket. Samuel studied her face quietly. Ruth looked calmer than she had in days. The small meal from the night before had given her a little strength. Her silver-gray hair rested loosely against the pillow, and the gentle lines around her eyes softened in sleep. Samuel allowed himself a quiet moment of relief. Outside, the neighborhood had begun its usual morning rhythm. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere down the street, and a distant radio played soft music from a neighbor's porch. Samuel stood slowly and poured 2 glasses of water from the small kitchen sink. Just as he set the glasses down, a sudden sound echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. Samuel froze. The knocking came from the front door. His heart tightened instantly. For a brief moment, the memory of the courtroom returned. The arrest, the charges, the uncertain faces. Samuel wondered if something had gone wrong. Perhaps there had been a mistake. Perhaps the dismissal had not been final. He walked slowly toward the door, his steps cautious. "Sam?" Ruth called weakly from the sofa. "It's all right," Samuel said gently. "I'll see who it is." He opened the door carefully. Standing on the porch were 3 unexpected figures. The first was Officer Daniel Brooks. Daniel looked the same as the previous day, tall, composed, wearing his dark Detroit police uniform. His expression today, however, carried a quiet kindness rather than the formal seriousness Samuel remembered from the arrest. Beside him stood a woman Samuel had never seen before. Her name was Karen Lewis. Karen Lewis was in her early 40s, medium height with warm brown skin and short natural curls framing her face. She wore a thick navy coat and carried a leather folder under one arm. Her posture was calm and confident, and her eyes reflected a genuine warmth that immediately made her seem approachable. Years of working in social services had shaped her personality into one that balanced professional efficiency with deep compassion. Behind them, parked along the curb, stood a white transport van with the words, "Sunrise Senior Community Center," printed across the side in gentle blue letters. Samuel blinked in confusion. "Officer Brooks," he said quietly. Daniel gave a small, respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Samuel glanced from Daniel to Karen. "Is there something wrong?" Karen stepped forward slightly, offering a warm smile. "Not at all, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "We're here because we'd like to help." Samuel remained silent for a moment, trying to understand. Daniel spoke again. "I spoke with Judge Whitman after the hearing yesterday," he explained. "He asked the city's social services department to take a closer look at your situation." Karen opened the folder gently. "We work with seniors who need assistance with housing, meals, and medical care," she said. "After reviewing your case, we believe we have a place where you and Mrs. Carter can live comfortably." Samuel's brow furrowed slightly. "What kind of place?" Karen gestured toward the van behind her. "It's called Sunrise Senior Community Center. It's a residential care facility not far from here. Residents have their own private rooms, regular meals, medical support, and outdoor space." Samuel turned slightly toward the living room where Ruth sat quietly listening. "You mean both of us?" he asked. Karen nodded. "Yes, sir. Both of you." Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly, but uncertainty remained in his voice. "And we can stay together?" Karen smiled again. "That's the most important part." Behind them, a small figure appeared at the end of the sidewalk. Lily Thompson stood there with wide, curious eyes. Lily had been walking to school when she noticed the unfamiliar van parked in front of the Carter house. The 9-year-old girl wore her usual pink jacket and carried a bright blue backpack over one shoulder. She approached slowly. "Mr. Sam?" she called. Samuel turned. "Well, good morning, Lily." Lily glanced at the van and the adult standing on the porch. "Everything okay?" she asked with the blunt honesty of a child. Samuel smiled gently. "I think it might be." Karen crouched slightly to Lily's height. "Hello there," she said kindly. "You must be Lily." Lily nodded. Karen stood again and looked toward Samuel. "If you'd like, we can help you and Mrs. Carter pack a few things." Samuel hesitated for a moment longer. Then he stepped aside. "Well," he said quietly, "you'd better come in." Inside the small house, Karen took a gentle look around the living room. She noticed the worn furniture, the thin blankets, and the small kitchen table that held very little. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes softened with understanding. Ruth sat upright on the sofa as they entered. Samuel walked to her side. "Ruth," he said softly, "these folks came to talk to us." Karen introduced herself kindly and explained the situation. Ruth listened carefully. When Karen finished, Ruth looked toward Samuel. "Sam?" she asked quietly. Samuel took her hand. "What do you think?" Ruth smiled faintly. "I think it sounds warm." Within an hour, the small Carter house was quiet again. Samuel carried a small suitcase containing a few clothes and photographs. Ruth sat comfortably in a wheelchair provided by Karen, wrapped in a warm blanket. Outside, the van engine hummed gently. Officer Brooks helped Samuel load the bag. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Carter," Daniel said. Samuel nodded gratefully. "Thank you, officer." The drive across Detroit took about 20 minutes. As the van moved through the city streets, the skyline slowly shifted from older neighborhoods to quieter residential areas lined with trees. Finally, the van turned into a peaceful campus surrounded by green lawns and brick buildings. A sign near the entrance read, "Sunrise Senior Community Center." The facility looked welcoming rather than institutional. A small garden sat near the entrance, and several elderly residents walked slowly along the pathways with nurses nearby. Samuel helped Ruth from the van. Inside, a bright dining hall smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread. For the first time in days, Samuel felt his shoulders relax completely. Later that afternoon, he and Ruth sat together on a wooden bench in the garden outside. The winter sun rested gently on their faces. Samuel held Ruth's hand. Across the lawn, Lily Thompson ran toward them with her mother beside her. Lily's mother, Amanda Thompson, was a young woman in her early 30s with tired but kind eyes and dark curly hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She worked long hours at a grocery store but always made time for her children. She had brought Lily to visit after hearing the news from Officer Brooks earlier that morning. "Mr. Sam!" Lily shouted happily. Samuel laughed softly. "Well, look who came to visit." Later that day, another visitor arrived. Judge Harold Whitman stepped quietly into the garden, his coat buttoned against the breeze. Samuel noticed him first. Whitman approached slowly. "Mr. Carter," the judge said politely. Samuel nodded. "Your Honor?" Whitman looked around the peaceful garden and then back at the couple sitting on the bench. "I thought I'd stop by and make sure things worked out." Samuel squeezed Ruth's hand gently. He looked toward the warm sunlight stretching across the lawn. Then he spoke softly. "Maybe life hasn't forgotten us after all." Ruth smiled beside him. The story of Samuel and Ruth reminds us of something very simple but very important in life. Sometimes the people who struggle the most are also the ones who complain the least. They do not shout. They do not demand attention. They simply endure quietly. In our busy modern world, it is easy to walk past people like Samuel without noticing their pain. But every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot see. This story teaches us that kindness should never depend on status, money, or appearance. A small act of compassion can change someone's life. One question asked with care, one helping hand, one moment of understanding can open a door that someone thought was closed forever. It also reminds us not to judge too quickly. From the outside, Samuel looked like a man who had broken the law. But behind that moment was a husband who loved his wife so much that he was willing to carry shame just to bring her something to eat. In everyday life, we must remember that the truth of a person's heart is often deeper than what we first see. Look around your own life. Maybe there is an elderly neighbor, someone lonely, someone who needs help but is too proud to ask. Sometimes the greatest difference we can make begins with something very small. A conversation, a visit, a meal, or simply treating someone with dignity. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Stories like this remind us that compassion still exists in the world. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson you learned from Samuel and Ruth. Your words might encourage someone else. If you enjoy meaningful stories about life, faith, and humanity, please subscribe to the channel and support the community so we can continue sharing stories that inspire hope. May God bless everyone watching this today. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your family, and kindness to your heart. If you believe that love, loyalty, and compassion still matter in this world, write Amen in the comments.